During the week of Christmas 1875, a 31-year-old man named Henry John Heinz lay in bed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, unable to get up. On some days, he could not face the morning at all. The company he had built with a friend named Clarence Noble had collapsed 2 weeks earlier. The panic of 1873 had reached Pittsburgh. The steel mills sat idle, and a contract he had signed the previous spring for the entire cucumber output of a farm in Illinois had turned from an opportunity into an avalanche. His assets totaled $110,000. His liabilities totaled $160,000. His home was mortgaged. His father's brickyard was mortgaged. He had been arrested twice on false accusations of hiding inventory from creditors, tried for fraud in January of 1876, and mercifully acquitted. His wife, Sarah, had lost 10 pounds from worry. He was a devout Lutheran from a German immigrant family, and for people like the Heinzes, bankruptcy was not just a financial event. It was a disgrace that followed you for the rest of your life. On New Year's Day of 1876, he gathered his family together and proposed something unusual. If his wife, his brother, his cousin, and his mother would pool what little they had left and form a new company, he would run it on salary. He could not legally own the business himself. He was, at that moment, an undischarged bankrupt. He carried a small notebook in his coat pocket during those years. Inside it, he kept a list of every person and every firm that the old Heinz, Noble and Company had owed money to. He marked the notebook M.O. It stood for moral obligations. He was not legally required to repay any of those debts. 5 years later, he had paid every single one of them back. The company he founded on the back of that notebook, the F&J Heinz Company, later renamed the H.J. Heinz Company, would go on to become the dominant ketchup producer on Earth. It would produce a United States senator who died in a mid-air collision over an elementary school, a widow who married one of the most famous politicians of the modern era and helped fund a presidential campaign, a family fortune that, 4 generations later, is still quietly shaping American politics, and a glass bottle so recognizable that in most kitchens in most countries in the English-speaking world, the word ketchup and the word Heinz have become functionally the same thing. Henry John Heinz was born on October 11, 1844, in the Birmingham section of Pittsburgh, the oldest of 8 children born to John Henry Heinz and Anna Margarita Schmidt. Both parents were German immigrants. His father, from the Palatinate region of Bavaria, worked as a brickmaker. His mother, from Hesse-Kassel, kept a large vegetable garden behind the family home after they moved to the village of Sharpsburg, just outside the city, when Henry was 5 years old. By the age of 8, Henry was selling the surplus from that garden door to door in a wicker basket. By 12, he was farming 3.5 acres of his own and selling grated horseradish prepared from his mother's recipe to grocers across Pittsburgh. The product that would change his life was that horseradish. Henry noticed something about the way his competitors packaged theirs. They almost always used green or brown glass bottles, and for good reason. Most commercial horseradish at the time was cut with turnip filler, wood shavings, and sometimes sawdust. The dark glass hid the fraud. Henry bottled his horseradish in clear glass jars so buyers could see exactly what they were getting. That single decision, made when Henry was still a teenager, would become the founding principle of everything that came after. Let the customer see what is inside. In 1869, at the age of 25, he partnered with his friend Clarence Noble and founded Heinz, Noble and Company. They expanded into pickles, sauerkraut, and vinegar. For 6 years, the business grew quickly. Then came the panic of 1873, and the cucumber contract, and the collapse, and the notebook marked M.O. The first major product of the rebuilt company in 1876 was tomato ketchup. Ketchup as a concept did not begin with the Heinz family. The word itself almost certainly comes from a Chinese sauce called ketchup, a fermented fish brine that British and Dutch traders encountered in Southeast Asia during the 1700s. For more than a century, ketchup in the English-speaking world meant whatever the cook felt like fermenting. There was mushroom ketchup, walnut ketchup, oyster ketchup, anchovy ketchup. Tomato ketchup did not become standard until the early 1800s, and even then it had a serious problem. Homemade tomato ketchup spoiled in days, and the commercial versions were often preserved with coal tar dyes, formaldehyde, and a particularly controversial chemical called sodium benzoate. Heinz used sodium benzoate in his own ketchup as late as 1904. But by the turn of the century, the federal chemist Harvey Washington Wiley had begun a very public campaign against food preservatives, and Heinz was paying attention. He asked his general manager and cousin, Sebastian Mueller, along with a chief scientist named G.F. Mason, to develop a ketchup that needed no chemical preservatives at all. It took them years. The solution, eventually, was a combination of higher quality tomatoes, a heavier concentration of vinegar, more sugar, and obsessive sanitation in the factory. The result was thicker, sweeter, and more expensive than what competitors were selling. It was also the ketchup that, more than 100 years later, is still in almost every diner in America. By 1906, Heinz had fully aligned himself with Wiley and with President Theodore Roosevelt in the push for federal food safety legislation. He was, according to historians, the only major food manufacturer to publicly support the Pure Food and Drug Act while it was being debated. When the act became law on June 30, 1906, Heinz's preservative-free ketchup was already on the shelves and ready to go. His competitors were not. By 1911, Heinz had won the ketchup war outright. By the early 20th century, his company was the largest ketchup manufacturer in America. There is a less flattering reading of this story, and it is worth mentioning. Some historians have argued that Heinz's support for the Pure Food and Drug Act was less about public health and more about using federal regulation to eliminate his cheaper competitors. The Act's sanitation requirements were based on large-scale industrial specifications that small regional producers could not meet. Henry Heinz was a reformer. He was also a businessman. Both things were true at the same time. Henry Heinz died at his home in Pittsburgh on May 14, 1919, at the age of 74, after contracting pneumonia. At the time of his death, his company operated more than 20 food processing plants, owned seed farms and container factories, and employed more than 6,000 people. His funeral was at East Liberty Presbyterian Church. He was buried in the Heinz family mausoleum at Homewood Cemetery, where he still lies today. He also left behind the most famous marketing slogan of his generation. In 1896, while riding an elevated train through New York City, he had spotted an advertisement for a shoe store promoting 21 styles of shoes. He liked the sound of it. He started counting up his own products and stopped at 57, even though the company was already selling more than 60. He said later that he chose 57 because 5 was his lucky number and 7 was his wife Sarah's. He also liked, as he put it, the psychological influence of the figure 7. The slogan was printed on delivery wagons, on trolley cars, on roadside signs, on hillsides, on the neck of every bottle. It is still on the neck of every Heinz ketchup bottle sold today, 130 years later. He also left behind a philosophy of how to treat workers that was unusual for the era. The Heinz factory in Pittsburgh provided its employees with free doctors, dentists, and nurses, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a rooftop garden, free cooking and sewing classes, an auditorium with a pipe organ where the company employed an organist to give recitals during lunch breaks. Female employees had their own dressing rooms, showers, and weekly manicures provided by the company. Henry believed that clean and respected workers made clean and respectable food. He said so often, and he meant it. The company passed to his son, Howard Heinz, who ran it through the Great Depression and into the early years of the Second World War. Howard died in 1941, and the business passed to his son, Henry John Heinz II, known his entire life as Jack. Jack Heinz was the figure who turned the company from a large American food producer into a multinational one. Under his leadership during the Second World War, the Pittsburgh plant was temporarily converted to manufacture military gliders for the war effort. After the war, he took the company public in 1946, and the Heinz family, which had owned the business outright for 3 generations, suddenly held stock worth a fortune on the open market. Jack acquired Ori-Ida frozen potatoes. He acquired Star-Kissed tuna. He expanded into dozens of countries. Educated at Yale and Cambridge, fluent in several languages, handsome and charming, he moved through the upper ranks of American and European society as easily as his grandfather had moved through the grocery stalls of Old Pittsburgh. He married a Pittsburgh woman named Joan Deal. They had one son. They named him Henry John Heinz III. Everyone in the family called him John. John Heinz was the great-grandson of a man who had once been too broke to buy his own groceries. By his early 30s, he had inherited a fortune worth several $100 million. He could have spent his life on yachts and in ski chalets. Instead, he ran for Congress. In November 1971, at the age of 33, he won a special election to represent Pennsylvania's 18th Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives. 5 years later, in 1976, he ran for the United States Senate. He narrowly won the Republican primary over a future senator named Arlen Specter, and he defeated his Democratic opponent in the general election. He was re-elected twice in 1982 and again in 1988 by wide margins each time. He was a moderate Republican in an era when such a thing still existed, a conservationist and a legislator known for working across party lines on Social Security, Medicare, and international trade. By the late 1980s, he was widely considered a potential future governor of Pennsylvania and, in some quarters, a potential future president. On the morning of April 4, 1991, Senator Heinz was returning from a news conference in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, aboard a twin-engine Piper Aerostar. There were 3 people on board, including the 2 pilots. As the plane approached Philadelphia International Airport around noon, the pilots noticed that the indicator light for the nose landing gear had not come on. They were not sure whether the gear was down and locked. A nearby helicopter operated by Sun Oil Company, a Bell 412 on its way to the company's headquarters, offered to fly underneath the plane and take a look. The final radio transmission from the helicopter crew was that the landing gear appeared to be down. A moment later, the rotor blades of the helicopter struck the underside of the airplane. Both aircraft were rendered uncontrollable. Both came down on the grounds of Marion Elementary School in Lower Marion Township, outside Philadelphia, where children were outside for their lunch recess. All 5 people on board both aircraft were killed. The National Transportation Safety Board later concluded that the crash was caused by poor judgment on the part of the pilots in both aircraft. Senator Heinz was 52 years old. His widow, Teresa, a Mozambican-born former United Nations interpreter who had met him while studying at the University of Geneva in the 1960s, inherited the bulk of the family fortune along with their 3 sons. 3 years later, in 1995, she married a junior senator from Massachusetts named John Kerry. In 2004, that senator became the Democratic Party's nominee for President of the United States. The Heinz fortune, built on a notebook full of debts in an 1876 Pittsburgh kitchen, quietly helped fund one of the most expensive presidential campaigns in American history. John Kerry lost that election to George W. Bush by a margin of roughly 2.5 percentage points. The H.J. Heinz Company itself, meanwhile, had been drifting. Through the 1990s and 2000s, it remained profitable, but increasingly out of fashion. Ketchup was still ketchup. Younger consumers were moving toward sriracha, toward specialty mayonnaises, toward fresher and more premium condiments. The family no longer ran the company day to day. Most of their stock had been diversified into foundations, charitable trusts, and the personal holdings of the next generation. On Valentine's Day of 2013, the company was sold. The buyers were Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway and a Brazilian private equity firm called 3G Capital. The deal was announced at $23.3 billion in equity, rising to $28 billion once debt was included. 2 years later, in March of 2015, Heinz was merged with Kraft Foods to create the Kraft Heinz Company, the 5th largest food company in the world at the time of the merger. The merger has not been, by most measures, a success. In early 2019, Kraft Heinz wrote down the value of its own brands by more than $15 billion in a single quarter. The stock price has underperformed the broader market ever since. As of early 2026, the combined company's market capitalization sits at around $25 billion, roughly the same figure 3G and Berkshire paid for Heinz alone 13 years earlier. The company that once dominated every kitchen table in America is now, in the language of Wall Street, a legacy asset. The Heinz family retains no operational control over the business their ancestor built. That brings us to the end of today's episode. A quick question before you go. Henry Heinz spent 5 years paying back debts he was not legally required to repay because he believed his reputation was worth more than the money. In 2026, do you think that kind of instinct still exists in American business, or has it gone the way of the 5-cent soda fountain? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for your time. We will see you in the next one.